Welcome guys, this is going to be an introductory video on phenotypes, genotypes, and Punnett squares. Before we begin, let's take a look at some familiar vocabulary from our previous chapter. If you want, pause the video for a second and see if you can't match these up, and then unpause it when you're ready to see the answers. So one of many alternative forms of a gene is going to be an allele. Segments of DNA that carry hereditary instructions for how to make proteins, that's going to be our gene. A distinguishing quality or characteristic that can be passed from one generation to another is going to be traits. And then lastly, DNA sequences that have matching genes but may differ in some or all of their alleles will be homologous chromosomes. You get one from mom, and one of those pairs comes from your father. So that's basically a quick little recap of some familiar vocabulary from previous chapters that will be really helpful to have a firm understanding of those words going forward. So here's our chapter. It's on heredity, which is the passing of traits from parents to offspring, from one generation to the next. And as always, there's going to be three key topics. Today, we'll introduce phenotypes, genotypes, and Punnett squares. Once we have a firm understanding of that, we'll move on to something called pedigrees, which is when you're looking at multiple generations and how the traits pass between them. And then we'll look at complex heredity patterns. The word complex shouldn't intimidate you. It's just a different set of rules for how the genes express themselves. All right, first, phenotype. So the word phenotype sounds like a pretty scary word. It doesn't really mean anything other than the physical expression of a trait. So it can refer to how an organism looks, smells, what it sounds like, its biochemistry. Phenotypes can be dominant or recessive. For reasons that we'll get into later, the letter P is sometimes associated with dominant and Q is associated with recessive, but we won't worry about that detail at this time. An organism's phenotype is a result of the alleles that it gets from its parents. This is called the genotype. We'll talk about that in just a second. A phenotype can also be influenced by the environment through epigenetics. So sometimes your phenotypes are turned on at a younger age and then turned off at an older age, just changing your appearance or your biochemistry or your underlying, just how your body functions. Yeah, like I mentioned, phenotypes are not limited to physical appearances, but also include all of your biochemistry and even behaviors. So the way that a bird builds a nest, believe it or not, is genetically encoded, that they have a drive, they have a genetic drive to want to build a nest. So behaviors can be genetic as well. A genotype, which is very closely related to phenotype, is the combination of alleles that a person has. If the allele is dominant, it uses the capital letter to express that that phenotype. So, for example, if curly hair is a dominant trait, we'll use the capital letter C to represent that allele. If the allele is recessive, but for the same gene category, for example, hair texture, it's going to use the same letter as the dominant phenotype, in this case curly, but it will be in a lowercase. So straight hair would be represented by a lowercase c. So kind of on these two homologous chromosomes over here, there might be a difference between, let's say, this band right here and that band. So that could represent that you may have gotten a dominant allele from your mother and a recessive allele from your father. And then the combination of those two alleles is your genotype. So tricks to remembering the difference between genotype and phenotype. Genotype starts with G, and it's the genetic code. The genotype represents the genetic code that codes for the proteins that result in your traits. And phenotype starts with PH, and so does the word physical description, or the word's physical description, because that's what a phenotype is. It's literally, they're adjectives. They're ways to describe the traits. So a genotype is a two-letter combination, big G, little g, big C, little g, something like that. And the phenotype is the actual physical description of what these alleles result in. So big G, little g might result in green eyes. Big C might result in curly hair. And that's genotypes and phenotypes. How many alleles do you have for every gene? Take a minute and think about it. You get one allele per chromosome that you get from each parent. So that means you have two alleles for every gene. One came from your mom and one came from your dad. And again, we represent alleles with uppercase and lowercase letters. The letter is shorthand. I just want to tie this back to a previous chapter. The letter is shorthand for an entire DNA sequence, which can range from 20 to 100,000 bases long. So to give you a better idea of that, here is our allele, our lowercase h allele on this part of the chromosome. Let's say that this h allele, this section codes for hair texture. So the little h is an allele for wavy hair. That letter, that H, represents a very specific segment of a chromosome, which again is a gene, and it has a sequence of nucleotide bases. So, for example, when we write little h, that might be referring to all of these bases. Now, I don't know how many there are there, but that looks like 1,000, maybe 1,030, something like that. So that is all of the bases that we learned about in the DNA chapter that code for wavy hair, the protein that would result in wavy hair. And we're going to represent that with just one little H right there as the allele to capture all those bases, which would become codons, which would become amino acids in your amino acid sequence. Remember, this entire code is to produce a protein. If the protein is slightly different, it can result in a slightly different trait. So if you knock out this C right there and replace it with a G, that might change the function of the protein, just that one small change. And then that would create a variation of this allele or of this gene, and that would be a new allele that gets created. So how many possible two-letter combinations can you make using uppercase and lowercase letters for hair texture? Well, one possible combination would be to have inherited a big H from mom and a big H from dad. So in which case you would have two dominant alleles. Another possible variation would be a big H from mom, oh, I'm sorry, a little h from mom and a little h from dad. So that's another variation. And you could also get a big H from one parent and a little h from the other parent. And there's your third variation. Now you might be thinking maybe if you do the little h first and then the big H second, does that make a difference? It does not. These two are the exact same thing, so you don't have this fourth variation. In fact, you typically write the dominant allele first. It really doesn't matter, but just by convention, if you have one dominant and one recessive allele, you write the capital letter first. So I'm going to get rid of that one. So these are our three different possible genotypes. And remember, the phenotypes are the actual physical descriptions that these genotypes would result in. So to give you some firm definitions of our three possible genotypes, when you have two dominant alleles, we call that homozygous dominant. Homo meaning same, zygos meaning of the zygote, which is that first cell, and dominant. So it's a homozygous dominant combination. This genotype has both dominant alleles and will result in a dominant phenotype. If you inherit two recessive alleles for a gene, then that would be called homozygous recessive. The genotype has both recessive alleles, and this will result in a recessive phenotype. And lastly, if you inherit one of each type of allele, a dominant and a recessive, we call that heterozygous. The genotype has a dominant and a recessive allele, but because it has one dominant allele, that's going to overpower the recessive one and will result in a dominant phenotype. So it will be indistinguishable from this first one up here. This homozygous dominant phenotype will look exactly the same as the heterozygous phenotype. Let's take a moment and talk about what does dominant and recessive traits actually mean. So we've talked about how to represent them with uppercase and lowercase letters, but the easiest way to think about them is that recessive alleles are usually the result of a non-functional or reduced functionality in a protein. And so because of that reduced or non-functionality, they're kind of a default setting, and then a dominant allele can override them. So let's look at some dominant alleles and some actual descriptions of them. So a dominant trait is a trait that only requires one of the alleles to be inherited that will do the work of making a functional protein. So you only need one allele to make a dominant trait. You can have two. You can have that homozygous dominant, but you only need one dominant allele, and then you will have that trait. So a list of dominant traits would be brown eyes, curly hair, a widow's peak, unattached earlobes, dark hair, straight thumb. And if a person's genotype is homozygous dominant, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have a more aggressive version of that trait. Sometimes it could, but not always. So typically, for example, a regular thumb and a hitchhiker's thumb, if you have a dominant allele, you'll just have a ligament that would result in a straight thumb here. Whereas if you inherit two recessive alleles, that will allow your ligament to be a little more elastic and bend back that upper part of the digit. Recessive alleles. Now, these are traits that require both of the same allele to be inherited. They are homozygous recessive. That's the only genotype that would allow you to have a recessive phenotype. Blue eyes, red hair, straight hair, baldness, attached earlobes, hitchhiker's thumb. These are all examples of recessive traits because of some lack of functionality. So, for example, the DNA sequence that results in blue eyes is there because the DNA, that the protein for brown pigmentation is broken. So you don't get that brown pigment anymore, and as a result, you get the default of having blue eyes. Now, I should say now that eye color traits is more complicated than simple dominant and recessive relationships. But for the purposes of understanding genetics initially, we're going to say that eye color follows this pattern. Although once we get into more complex heredity, we'll see that it actually doesn't. All right, as a really neat and clean analogy, let's say you have a window, and this piece of glass has two sides, which are going to represent our two alleles for the gene. You only need to paint one side in order for it to be considered colored. You can paint both if you want to, but you don't have to. All you need is to paint one side. So the painting, the paint, the ink, that's going to be our dominant allele. If you paint one side and you try to look through the glass, you won't be able to see through it anymore. In order for the glass to be transparent, both sides have to be clear. So recessive traits work the same way. There needs to be a loss of functionality in both alleles in order for the gene to be considered recessive. Now, you can paint both sides and have that homozygous dominant effect, but you don't necessarily need to. All right, so let's pause here for a second, or rather, we're going to transition into Punnett squares, which is a representation of possible offspring genotypes. So how would you describe the chromosomes below that have the same genes but different alleles? Those are called homozygous chromosomes. So we're going to say this set of chromosomes belongs to your mother and this set belongs to your father, which means that the genes on these chromosomes belong to your grandma and grandfather, right? So it's a whole bunch of ancestors that are represented here. During meiosis, your mom's and dad's genes are separated into haploid gametes. Haploid meaning they have half the amount of genetic information. Gametes is just another word for sex or reproductive cells like sperm and egg. 50% of the gametes get one allele and 50% get the other allele. When your sex cells combine, when the sperm and egg combine again, they combine their alleles to give you back that diploid number. So, for example, if we look at this gene right here, let's say that that gene, one of them you can see has horizontal lines and one has vertical lines. So let's say that the vertical lines are the dominant allele and the horizontal lines are the recessive. So her genotype, your mom's genotype, is a big B and a little b. During meiosis, the big B will go into 50% of the gametes and the little b will go into 50% of the gametes. Down here, your father has two dominant alleles. They're both represented by vertical stripes. So his genotype for this gene, whatever it happens to be, is big B, big B. And during the formation of sperm by meiosis, 50% will get this big B and 50% will get that big B. Now, it doesn't really matter because it's the same gene, but it does make a difference in your mother's genes, right? So these are your possible gametes here. All right, so, okay, so we're going to say that that gene codes for hair color. So the big B is going to be brown hair, and the little b, the recessive one, will be blonde hair. So during the formation of your mom's gametes, there will be 50% will have the dominant brown hair allele, and 50% will have the recessive blonde hair allele. For your father, he will get 50% having that one and 50% having this one. Now, again, it doesn't matter because it's the same allele, right? So Punnett squares are used to represent the possible allele combinations and the children that could be created when those parental gametes are combined. So on the outside of the box, that will represent your parents' alleles and the gametes that hold that genetic information. Now, let's go back to this one actually. So when the inside of the box, those are the different possible gamete combinations. So we're gonna take this one, and this child would inherit a dominant brown allele from mom and would get the dominant brown allele from dad. So this child would be homozygous dominant. This child would get the dominant allele from dad. Oops, let me take it from here. And then it would get the recessive allele from mom. Down here, this child would again be like the one above it, dominant allele from mom, a dominant allele from dad, and then lastly, we would have this one be the dominant allele from dad, followed by the recessive allele from mom. So we have a 50% chance of having homozygous dominant children and a 50% chance of having a homozygous or a heterozygous child. All right, now let's say your dad was heterozygous. So instead of these two dominant alleles, let's say one of them was a recessive little b. So I'll put this one up here, kind of covering that guy like that. So this means that this child, you have in one of your four boxes, there's a possibility of getting homozygous dominant genotype. In this box, this child would be a heterozygous genotype. This box would also be a heterozygous genotype, but from different alleles, right? That's a dominant allele from dad, that's a dominant allele from mom. And in this box, we have a possibility of having a homozygous recessive child. So of our 4 possibilities, 25% of them would have blonde hair. These 3, even though these are coded somewhat differently, because the dominant allele is here, they would all have brown hair. All right, Punnett squares can be logic puzzles too. So let's say a person you know has a hitchhiker's thumb. This is a recessive phenotype, so that means that both alleles have to be lowercase. That person's mother also has a hitchhiker's thumb. That's a clue. However, his sister has a straight thumb. What is the genotype and phenotype of the father? So the mother's genes will be over here. And we know that she has a hitchhiker's thumb. So the mother must be little t, little t. So we'll put that information in first. And the person that you know also has a hitchhiker's thumb. So at least one of these possible offspring has to be little t, little t. So let's make this box little t, little t. So if this person inherited a little t recessive allele from their mother, where did this one come from? Well, that one must have come from the father, which makes this a little recessive allele. And now we can solve this fourth box right here, which means that they got a recessive allele from mom and a recessive allele from dad. So there's a recessive, homozygous recessive genotype. Now the other clue is that the sister doesn't have a hitchhiker's thumb. So they're either big T, or they're big T, little t, homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Well, because the mother can only pass down recessive alleles, there's no possibility for the sister to be homozygous dominant, inheriting both dominant alleles. So that means that the father must have a big T in there, which means that's the genotype for the sister. So 50% of the offspring would be homozygous recessive, and 50% would be heterozygous. When you get a Punnett square, you can summarize the outcome using genotypic and phenotypic ratios. A genotypic ratio is the simplest ratio of all genotypes in the possible offspring, and a phenotypic ratio is the simplest ratio of all phenotypes in the possible offspring. So like in the case above or the case below, previously, the genotype ratio is for every one heterozygous genotype, there's one homozygous recessive. So it's a 50-50 split. And then the same ratio applies to the phenotype. For every one straight thumb, there's one hitchhiker thumb in the offspring. So let's change this a little bit. Let's have 2 heterozygous parents. So a dominant allele on the top and a recessive allele, and then a dominant and a recessive allele for this parent as well. That means that the genotypic ratio of the offspring would be 1 homozygous dominant to 2 heterozygous to 1 homozygous recessive. The phenotypic ratio, if you look at the phenotypes here, think about which one of these would be. How many straight thumbs would you have? You would actually have 3. You have this one, and then these 2 heterozygous ones, and then you'd have 1 hitchhiker thumb. So the phenotype ratio is not always the same thing as the genotype ratio, although it often is. All right, thank you very much for watching.